Hi everyone, you're looking at the face of someone who just recorded this talk and didn't have their microphone turned on. So if I seem a little bit drowsy or droopy, it's because I know I'm going to just be saying the same thing I said for the last hour. But yeah, today my talk's going to be on creating reactive art and looking at my game, Umurangi Generation. So before I begin, I'd like to do, hang on, before I do any of this, is it actually recording? Yeah, seems like it is. Good. Okay. I'm going to do an acknowledgement of country, and so the idea of that is to say I want to acknowledge and pay respect to the elders, both past and present, and emerging on the lands on which I work, which is Bunjil country. And so with that, I'll start. So who am I? My name is Naphtali Faulkner. I'm a Ngai Te Rangi designer living here in Australia. So I made Umurangi Generation, which is a first-person photography game set in the shitty future, and we'll probably get into what that is. So the idea of this talk is we're going to talk about creating like reflective or reactive art. So the idea is to say, let's make art about the time it was made, like reflective of the time it was made. So speaking to when it was made and reflective to what's going on. The reason I say this is because we've seen a lot of games attempt to do something similar to this, and they'll usually trip over and fall right on their face. And I think there's probably a reason for that, which is either like maybe it's a corporate structure thing where certain corporate overlords are not necessarily able to tell, or not able to sort of let people tell the message. And then I think there's the other side of it where sometimes stuff that needs to be said is kind of not said correctly, or it's not said by the right people. So my thinking around all this is that, you know, like say as a basic example here, we often see, you know, sort of like AAA games where they there's like sort of the thing we can kind of tell they're not allowed to really talk about stuff because it would hurt the shareholders' sales. But I think like in indie games specifically, this should be something we should be trying to do all the time, because essentially what it is it pulls the industry forward, and it can essentially show that you know, this stuff is actually able to be talked about, and you know, AAA games should probably do it as well, which I think as a whole that would be something which would push the industry further and further forward. So my thinking just going in is there'll be spoilers for Umurangi Generation here. So if you haven't played it or you have interest in playing it, don't do that just yet. Like, don't watch this. Just click off, go talk to your friends for an hour, and then come back to LudoNarraCon, and I'll be finished waffling. Okay. But yeah, basically the idea is you probably don't want to watch this anyway, because if you don't know much about Umurangi Generation, and specifically the macro DLC, this is probably not going to make much sense to you. I'm going to make this talk more for people who have played and they understand what the hell I'm even talking about here, because I think it's one of those things where, or one, it's my brilliant marketing plan where you have to play my game to watch my talk. But I think it's also the idea that I just don't want to have to go over all this stuff. That, you know, I don't want to have to explain this game that you can finish in 3 hours, you know, for an hour talk. Let's just get straight into it. So bye-bye to everyone who hasn't played it. LudoNarraCon should now be seeing 10,000 people drop off their stream. But right, why talk about this? What's the point? Why should we talk about this idea of reactive or reflective art in the first place? You know, my thinking is, why did I want to talk about this specifically in this talk, rather than, you know, just giving a sort of basic overview of design or something like that. I think for me it's this idea that we as game designers all have to collectively grow this industry, and I mean grow it out of its sort of angsty teen period more into its adulthood, right? And I think it's this kind of thing where, you know, I believe that once we start to get to this thing where games can sort of talk about, I guess, political or topics similar to how film can, in terms of, okay, let's talk about, say for example, let's use a really basic example here of like Full Metal Jacket, right? That's a movie about sort of what the fuck's going on in war and how it changes people. Now we haven't really seen that with maybe a handful of cases in the game industry, and I think it's this whole thing where I think a lot of the times game developers are kind of either too afraid or the medium just isn't at its maturity yet to where people can not look at it as a a board game of Scrabble. They can't see games as an art form. They're still seeing them as a product. So I think there's this idea for me where I'd like to see games grow to this point where your sort of 6 days of Fallujah can be this critical thing rather than having to be sort of worked into a more commercialized product that's able to be sort of like, I get the point of that game where it's this idea of taking soldiers' stories and retelling them, but you're still getting the, I guess, jingoistic sort of non-critical look at what that war was even about. So if you've ever heard that term, "Are games political?" you know that we've got about 5 to 10 seconds until sort of like Twerp will run in and yell in your face and show you examples of like Snake and things like that. Like, Snake, that's not a political game, right? So, are games political? You have no, and then I think my response is no, but they should be. And not to say no in terms of I don't think they should be political. I think at the moment they kind of aren't. They're not really going beyond or going where they need to go in terms of what artistic mediums can usually do. So, my thinking around that is not to say, oh, every boss or every bad guy in the game has to be Donald Trump. That's not what I'm saying. I think it's more the idea of saying we should be sort of putting these sort of more like political or social concepts in games because it grows the medium sort of in the long run. Like if we are sort of doing sort of like Kubrick-esque type stuff in games, it's going to sort of grow the industry further to the point where like we're going to see better games as a result. Like I think now what you might have just realized is I've just said something where the moment I've now said that, we sort of have that thing when people say, oh, well, what about Snake, right? What I mean to say by that is that, if we're going to sort of, okay, let's go deep dive into this. There's a paper by Frome in 2007 called 8 Ways Video Games Generate Emotion. And in that paper, he sort of talked about, first of all, there's sort of like 4 types of games, gameplay game, simulation game, narrative game, crafted works of art. So your games like Snake or Tetris or something like that sort of fall into that gameplay game space where it's, about like getting a high score and things like that. Then you have like your simulation games like Arma or like, Flight Simulator or something like that, where the idea of the game is to sort of simulate reality. Then you have like a narrative game, which could be, and sometimes when people hear the term narrative game, they get all seedy or whatever. But like the idea is that a narrative game could essentially be something like Devil May Cry or Mario, right? Where the idea is the game is no longer about getting a high score; it's about completing a story. And that's not to say the story's quality has to reach, certain Shakespearean heights or anything like that. More the idea that like the story is what you're playing it for. You're playing it to get through a set of events, right? So in Devil May Cry, for example, you do have a scoring system, but the idea of the game is essentially to get through with those characters to the end. And then you have sort of the crafted works of art, which is like, the idea of things like maybe Grease or, Eco or Shadow of the Colossus or something like that, where it's this idea that the gameplay itself has the artistic message sort of in it. Or the sort of game as a whole is the art, if that makes sense. Like you can't really take one part away or whatever, right? Now, I realize I've just opened a complete can of worms there because now every YouTube dickhead who makes like hour-long videos is going to say that whatever his childhood game was is a work of art. But I think there's more that idea that when the game was made, it's sort of like the designer themselves sort of understood the sort of, they had the intention to sort of make it art. I don't think there's this thing like the accidental artist. I don't think that exists. So from that, in Frome's paper, he kind of talked about this idea of, the observer participant and the actor participant, right? And so the idea around that is to say, like, when you're playing these kind of games and things like that, the way you sort of observe things in that space, which he referred to sort of like emotion inputs, is sort of this idea that like, if you're an observer participant, like for example, if you're sort of playing, like let's say Spec Ops: The Line or something like that, and a narrative event happens, it's a narrative situation. Whereas like if you're an active participant in something like, let's say, like Fallout New Vegas or something like that, when you see a thing happen, it's not a narrative situation. It's like a role play where you're actually in that space doing the narrative rather than just observing and sort of like seeing that unfold. So the idea is to say, like, I don't think Snake is necessarily a right place to sort of make political discourse, but like the joke around that is like you definitely could make Snake some kind of like expression of like political or sort of like a reactive artwork to how things were going at the time. Now I don't think Snake would work necessarily, but I have seen sort of Game for Game and things like that in the past where they have sort of tried to make a score out of things like, you know, corruption and things like that. So that's the sort of brilliance of the medium, is that we can literally do whatever we want with this space. And I think it's the whole thing where a talented designer can come through and pretty much like change how the medium sort of could be used to sort of convey art and things like that. So I really think, you know, whilst I think like Snake's probably not a good, or you know, this, you know, like whatever example these people might give to you of why it's not a good example, I don't think that really answers the question of if it could be. So yeah, moving on. We're going to now talk about Umurangi Generation Macros DLC, which the main concept of the base game is, what would neoliberalism do if blank? So the idea is to say, how would the same constructs which put us in the situation we're in now look like if blank, right? So the basis of that is to say, like, when the game came out, I sort of used my sort of like my own sort of personal experience with the bushfires in Australia, and sort of was like, I was like watching and looking at sort of like what was going on. You know, how did essentially the government respond to something that, for all intents and purposes, they caused, right? Like, the idea around that is to say that like these bushfires were essentially a result of climate change. Every single scientific expert, firefighter, and like a bunch of other people have sort of said the time to act on this was 20 years ago. You know, there's no point sort of doing the whole, you know, how who could have predicted this when the reality is we all kind of knew, right? So the big thing around that was like when these bushfires happened, it seemed that the only time the Prime Minister started to care was when it started to get close to North Shore Sydney, which is where a bunch of the rich donors of his party live, right? So, you know, and there's a bunch of other stuff where Scotty went on a holiday to Hawaii and things like that. Yeah, a bunch of other stuff, right? But that's more of like, when we're talking about ScoMo, that's more of a irrelevant thing to more of the structure that sort of informs a lot of that stuff. You know, whilst it's funny to sort of point and laugh, the idea is that we're talking mainly structural. So for anyone not kind of familiar, when I'm talking about this idea of liberalism, I'm not talking about left or right. I'm talking more about this idea of the backbone of Western political thought, right? Like in terms of this sort of like space that has sort of like I guess the DNA of pretty much every like Western political system in it. So like there's sort of this idea of like, it started as this idea of like classical liberalism, which is leave people alone and they'll come up with the best solution. You know, just let people do what they want and they'll come up with the best idea. And the critique of that was, well, okay, they have come up with the best system, but now because they're the ones who got in first, they literally now own everything, right? Like the idea is that if you're the one who sort of did whatever you want to begin with, now all the people down in the bottom 10% are unable to get anywhere, right? Like kind of that idea that, you know, a lot of people who seem like who sort of try to position themselves as these great intellectuals talk about a mythical libertopia where everyone just does what they want and everyone just gets along. Well, if that was the case, the idea is to say that like, well, the first person who got to that island actually has more rights than everyone else, because essentially everyone coming in after that would be essentially treading on his do whatever I want, right? Because it's his space, right? So you had that in terms of classical liberalism, and then from that, you sort of had the idea of social liberalism, which was this sort of thing of like, basically it was a response to sort of the, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saying, hey, we don't have to put up with this anymore. The idea of saying we could actually say that we own, means of production or whatever, right? And the idea is social liberalism was essentially a like half-assed band-aid response to that, to say, oh, no, we hear you. And the idea was to say, we'll redistribute some of the wealth that the, richest have, and we'll redistribute that through society. And the critique we're now on now, because all of these are essentially critiques of the last thing, classical liberalism is essentially a critique of like the sort of monarch or system before it, right? The system we're sort of in now is neoliberalism, and that's the idea of, we've turned everything into a nanny state, and we need to pull people up by their bootstraps and blah, 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 right? And the idea is to say that that system is not a left or right system. It can essentially be either, Essentially, if you're in that system, you're basically just looking at a different interpretation of what that concept means in spaces. So, when you see right-wingers talk about this idea that we've created a nanny state, right, or whatever, right? Everyone just needs to stop being PC and grow up, right? And then when you see left-wing people sort of do that, the idea is we should just let everyone do what they want, and they should be able to be empowered to do this kind of stuff, right? This all completely ignores the fact that, basically all this stuff's run by, the same bloody donors, right? But won't get too far into that, or else we'll be talking all day. So basically, that was the base game, and the idea of the DLC was to sort of look at what is the relationship between fascism and neoliberalism. And the idea around that is to say, like, with fascists, how does this stuff grow when you have like a neoliberal space in it? And so like the idea with the game is to sort of not necessarily recontextualize, because it was sort of there to begin with, but to sort of make plain the idea that the UN in this space are bad, like they are the fascists, right? The idea is to say that the UN was sort of either taken over by or sort of, consumed by one fascist nation, and then that just controlled the UN after that. So the idea in the game is that, when the kaiju sort of attack, you have the UN response, right? Now, the idea in this game is that like the UN now pretty much control everything, right? They have troops occupied everywhere. They have bullshit laws about not being able to, eat certain things and whatever, right? Basically, they're just sort of doing a fascist agenda with sort of this idea of, well, we're protecting you, aren't we? Right? Which is really hard for people to argue when you have these kaiju. But there's a reason why people can still tell them to get fucked, and we'll get into that, right? Basically, if you've ever read Michael Parini's book, Black Shirts and Reds, it's this idea that, I believe it's in chapter 3, is this idea, neoliberalism would much rather see fascists in control than any form of progressive action done by communists, right? And it's sort of that idea of like, when we're sort of looking at this game's DLC, essentially we're sort of looking at sort of how does fascism behave? Because the idea that I sort of wanted to look at was a lot of times in games when fascists are sort of portrayed, they are portrayed in this way where they are not actually reflective of fascists, or they are portrayed in a way where the fascism component is seen as this thing where it's either, you get to the fascist at the end and he says, I was just possessed by a demon, or I was crazy, or I didn't actually mean to do it, or something like that, right? Where they're essentially saying that this system can be defeated in the end with nice words, right? So moving on with my evil communist rant there, I'm going to just talk a little bit now about what was going on in sort of macro DLC space, in terms of what was that looking at in terms of how this sort of fascist space grows. So I guess the easiest place to start is, how did this play out IRL last year, right? And so I think the big thing that I thought about, looking at this in terms of making a reactive artwork to what was going on, was looking at sort of the protests, right? What was being said in community. So when the game sort of originally came out, this was, I believe, during the week or a week before George Floyd was murdered. And the idea around that was, when that happened, originally we were planning on doing a bit more of a positive DLC, like maybe doing just like a little sort of pack of levels. But Thor and I, the composer, we were pretty blown away by what was going on there. And so, you know, one of the things we watched a lot of was, obviously on Twitter you saw videos and stuff, but you could also watch live streams of what was happening, say, like at the precinct when that burnt down. And so we watched, you know, heaps of hours of footage of that. And then, you know, for me, I sort of also compared that to what was going on in Australia at the time. And, you know, I had a friend who ran a Black Lives Matter protest over here, and it was completely peaceful. But one of the things which came out of that was that the police sort of said on live TV, oh, we expected it to be more violent, and they were ready for, you know, they were all gunned up, ready to go. And, you know, the other thing around that was, in Australia, our news media is basically owned by one person. It's owned by Rupert Murdoch, right? And the story around that is, if you're Australian living in Australia, you can own 90% of the media. And if you're an American living in America, you can own 50% of the media. And Rupert Murdoch's a dual citizen between Australia and America. So basically, when we were sort of, when I turn on the TV, you would not see the truth. You would see this sort of Murdoch story, which was that what was happening in the States was actually a race riot. It wasn't about you know, the police. It was about evil, scary black people. That's basically what the you know, news media was sort of saying, right? And then basically the other thing I'm sort of thinking around all this was, why does this all feel really familiar when looking at, say, like my own history and stuff, right? Like my own family history and things like that. Why does what I'm seeing on TV not feel like it's actually new at all? So one of the big words or big phrases that I remember really distinctly from watching all that riot footage was, and even that word, right, riot versus protest. That's a you know, term which I think is, even that's a, you know, interesting how that sort of plays out, where some people will only refer to it as a riot because they want to be seen as this thing, whereas other people will say that it's a protest because they don't want to be seen as radical, or they don't necessarily want to talk about sort of the anger people are feeling in community, right? But anyway, the big thing I remember seeing on this footage was there was a young person there, and they said, if you won't hear us, fear us. That was basically right after the precinct got burnt down. And then a few hours later, you had the National Guard roll in, and they, you know, became a giant hypocrisy a couple of months later. But I think the biggest thing around all that was that what we saw in that space was that the police were able to, well, were not able to, they were willing to break their own rules. They wanted to break their own rules. They wanted to do things which they weren't allowed to do. So, you know, we saw police, you know, bash the skulls in of people who were, you know, senior citizens for no reason other than just standing there. One of the big ones I remember seeing was that, as I said, the Australian news media is owned by Rupert Murdoch, was that we're sitting there, well, I didn't see it live, but I saw the clip of it and then I rewatched it, was you've got the 9 News and they have their little chevron down the bottom that says race riot in America, and they're trying to make it look like a big scary thing. And they have their reporter there live on air in Lafayette Park or Lafayette Square. And they're there just standing there and she's talking, and then the riot police charge on them, and they start bashing the news reporters that are all clearly labelled press. And so then there was this big moment where these people, essentially little puppets for Rupert Murdoch, had to try and not say the complete obvious in the room there. That was this is clearly not about black people. This is about police. This is about police breaking their own rules, right? And that's not to say it's not something like where Black Lives Matter was involved, and obviously I still think it is obviously related to black people, but this idea of saying that it's the fault of black people, not the police, is what a lot of these news stations tried to say. So, the idea of saying, what does this sort of space look like? What is this sort of fascist space? What are elements to this fascist space that lead to this sort of thing where the police break their own rules and that? The first area is called Gamer's Palace, and it's about what does tolerating fascism look like? So how does this stuff get introduced in gaming? How does it get disseminated online? Who is able to just sit by and ignore it? And who benefits from the aesthetic of resistance to it? So in this level, the idea is that when you get to this place, it's quite vibrant and got all this banging music playing. And what happens then is you realise your friends aren't there, and you go outside and the music cuts off and you see that your friends are just sitting there and they still have to wait out their lockdown. And when you go back in, what you find is that this is a space where people are able to ignore what's happening. They're able to completely check out from what's happening up top. They don't have to worry about the kaiju. They just have to party and keep going on with their life. So in that space we see rich businessmen in the VIP lounge, but you also see your sort of supposed cyberpunk who's able to sort of talk about this idea of being a street soldier and stuff, but is able to just sort of ignore it all. And in that space you've sort of got a clothing store, and what it is in that clothing store, it's to sort of look at your sort of quote unquote resistance types who talk a lot about this idea of resistance and everything, but are then very pro-cop still, or for example, now that Joe Biden's elected, they don't seem to care too much about kids in cages or anything like that. And so to talk a little bit about that, it's this idea of saying actually this stuff sort of has a way it behaves, right? And in this Gamer's Palace, it's to look at sort of like what's going on, right? What's going on in here and what's going on outside there. And so as you're in that space, you also see that there are like your YouTube talking heads from Trigger Warning Media, and you've also got your Liberty Inc., which is your conservative Koch brothers funded thing. And what they're doing is they're essentially making videos about why what's happening up top, you shouldn't worry about it. So it's that idea of saying that what's going on the surface, it's actually not a big deal because we've killed heaps of kaiju, so there's probably not many left. Or they're saying, kaiju scientists, that's only been a discipline for 10 years. I'm just as qualified to talk about this thing, right? So then in the next level, we look at the UN hangar, which is what does this sort of fascism look like behind the curtain? So you sort of have your outward approach, and then you have your sort of what's going on in like behind the sort of where people probably shouldn't see it, right? So what you often see in that space is you've got posters on the outside where the UN are saying, we've done such a good job, and we've also got this new young female pilot who's going to pilot the robot, and it's going to be this really great thing, right? And then when you get behind the curtain, you see all these posters where the UN are essentially telling the workers, don't tell people how fucked we are. Don't let people know that we are going to lose this. You know, here's a graph. We're only 43% fucked. You know, don't tell secrets. It's gonna make us all look bad, right? And you know, then you start to see that like there's also other propaganda in there where they're talking about, you know, what would your ancestors think of you, or you know, this kind of thing. And I think the big thing around that was I wanted to obviously make these fascists. I didn't want you to like them. I didn't want you to say that the UN were good, right? So that when you could protest them at the end, you could know why. Because as I said earlier, I think far too often in games, when fascists are portrayed, they're completely, you know, whitewashed. They're not. They're no longer representative of the fascist stuff. They've been sort of what's the best word for that? The word is they've been rounded off in terms of to look much less threatening. And I think that's really scary, right? But the idea is to say, you know, when this stuff happens in this kind of space, the idea is that like the fascists should not be no longer fascists when you're portraying them. And one of the problems I sort of ran into was when I was making their fascist propaganda, I realized I was just making fascist propaganda. And that sort of was the kind of thing where I had a chat with one of my friends and they said, maybe you should exaggerate it even further to show the absurdity of it. And so that's kind of what I did, which was let's make this stuff really plainly stupid, but still be sort of in the style of fascist propaganda. So, you know, one of the things, you know, you sort of have the benefit with this DLC is that everyone's already played the base game. So they already know what's coming. The idea of that is to say, when they play the base game, they know that there's not going to be a next week. There's not going to be a we'll fix that later, because they know that later is not going to come, right? And the idea around that is to say that when the sort of UN are in this space, what they essentially do is they're doing this kind of thing where they're talking about going back to a 2020 vision, right? You know, that's some of the other great things. Say, one of the things fascists tend to do is say, like, they have this myth of a glorious past, right? And so, to show the absurdity of that, we said, what if these fascists were saying, wouldn't it be so good if we went back to 2020? Which I'm sure we can all have a laugh about, right? But that's the absurdity of the thing, right? And I think giving this sort of stuff, this sort of space where you can show that this is how it works, but also being able to critique it, I think was the idea of that. Now, if I succeeded, I succeeded, and if I didn't, I didn't. But the idea was to say, rather than being like all these other games that completely sort of miss the point or whitewash this idea of fascism, let's make a game where the fascism is true to what fascism is, so that when you go to sort of resist against it, there's a reason why you're doing it. So third level in the DLC is called the depths, and that's about who's affected by this. So the idea around that is to say that the people in the depths are the collateral damage that these UN robots, the Peace Sentinel, have been destroying. So often these fascists will sort of portray this thing as being saviors of something, right? And that gives them free rein to do whatever the hell they want. The UN might have these giant robots which they have some resistance against, basically a god, right? But they're not winning, so why should that give them any right to just, you know, casually destroy people's communities in the face of this stuff? Now, if you've played the base game, you know, which you have at this point, you've seen that people have told the UN to fuck off. You know, you've seen that there's stuff going on in that space, right? And the idea with the depth is to say, these are the people who live beneath the beneath, right? So in the base game, the UN have gone, well, not the UN, but the sort of rich and people who don't want to care about this stuff. They live below ground. They don't have to worry about what's going on top anymore. They can sort of not even really discuss what's going on. And then when that happens, they have people beneath them as well, and those are the beneath in terms of the people who they are now pushing below them as well, right? So when you get to that space, you'll see a lot of people with sort of your cyberpunky robotic arms and stuff, and the reason isn't because, wow, cool robotic arm, it's because those people were, they had their lives destroyed by these robots. And the idea around that is to say that, like, these are the people who end up copping the brunt of this, right? And the idea is, like, in the base game, you've seen that as well. You've gone to Karikari, and you've seen, how a community has responded to the cops. And you've seen that they've said, fuck off. We'll police ourselves. Like, we'll get our own little defense force here, and they'll protect us. We don't want you, right? You're just going to cause more problems. All right, and then they got the last area, which is the underground city. And the idea is to say, what does it look like when you push back? So the idea is to say, you've got anti-fascism, and then you've got cops that break their own rules. And the idea around that is that in that space, you've got your sort of protests going on, and you've got all this graffiti where people are saying what's being said in that space. And the idea is, once you finish that level, you're told to go to a monument for the UN, and when you get there, the city goes into lockdown. A bunch of walls get put up, and then they turn the sky off because the sky's artificial. And then they replace that sky with a stop sign, stop, you're under arrest, right? And then they deploy this thing that they've been saying is there to protect you on you. And when that happens, that's when the riot police come out and they start bashing protesters across the head. And then once they've gone through enough protesters, these riot police beeline it for you, a photographer, and they bash you over the head. You wake up and you see the aftermath of what's happened here, where there is holes in the ground from where the robot has opened fire on people. You see body bags in the street, and you and your friends get out and go up. They go to the top side, right? They take a tunnel back to the top, and then what happens is that the game ends not by scoring you, but it scores the police, or the UN more specifically, this neoliberal system. And it says, actually, every time the police do this response to resistance, it costs them billions of dollars, right? And if they're only going to listen to money, this is how you talk to them.
DJ Tariq.